Great. Welcome all to the event today on evolution of clinical trials. We've got an amazing panel for you here today, providing lots of examples and case studies in terms of using remote clinical trials. Oops. Sorry, I think my video was off. Remote clinical trials, use of AI, and focus on regulation as well. Very practical event using lots of case studies and examples. So hopefully you will get a lot out of this session here. I should say we're running this event. So Aurora Digital, which is myself, is running this event in coordination with Tech UK and Midas. So thank you very much for their support. And in fact, Tom Russell will actually be moderating the session. Tom Russell is lead healthcare over at Tech UK. Just a short background on Aurora Digital you may not have heard of before. We focus with supporting and showcasing great tech from around the world. And what we try to do as part of that is run some thought leadership events, which have a tech angle as well, not exclusively a tech angle, but have a tech angle as well. And this is certainly one of those that we're running here today. So I hope you get a lot out of it. We've got an amazing panel for you. If you have any questions, we would love to hear them as the event runs forward. Otherwise, please share with us afterwards. We will send a poll out after the event. And with that done, I will hand over to Tom, who's going to be your moderator for the event.
Thank you very much, Sandeep, and welcome everyone to this great session that we have planned today. First up, we have Jonathan Wogel, who's the COO, and John McRae, who is the CTO for Northwest eHealth, and they're going to be talking to us a little bit about how clinical trials have evolved and look at organisations, as well as how sort of new technologies have the promise for helping to advance remote clinical trials. So with that, I'm going to hand over to John and Jonathan, who are going to be talking for about 15 minutes and share a couple of slides. And then crack on with the rest of this opening discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Tom, for the introduction. Yeah, so we're going to do a bit of a double act, I think, in our session. We're going to talk about a few things, a case study called the Salford Lung Study, which was a clinical trial which finished a few years ago now, but is very much apt for the conversation today. We're going to talk about improvements to trial feasibility and recruitment. That'll be mainly Jonathan talking about that, and some current projects, as well as some technologies to enable virtual trials and reduce trial costs. So I'm going to start. So hopefully you can see the first slide there, which is obviously about the Salford Lung Study and its design. So the Salford Lung Study, I suppose we're most famous for that, and we follow the model of that study even today. It was the world's first real-world, pragmatic, randomized safety and effectiveness trial on a pre-licensed drug. Now that's quite a long-winded way of describing a trial, but basically it means that it allowed patients in the study to be closely monitored in real time with minimal intrusion into their everyday lives. And I suppose, why is that different than a traditional clinical trial? Well, a traditional RCT can be a bit artificial. The Salford Lung Study was really asking, does this drug work in the real world? So it used a broad patient population and their interactions with medications for other conditions, which is quite unique. The Salford Lung Study, the name of it is not quite correct. There are actually two studies, one in asthma and one in COPD. And it wasn't just in Salford, it was in Salford and areas of Manchester. Apart from that, I think the name is correct. So this is a slide showing some of the numbers for the COPD study. 2,800 patients recruited. As I've discussed, it's quite a broad inclusion criteria. Patients in primary care over the age of 40, diagnosed with COPD, taking an ICS, a corticosteroid, or LABA and LAMA, beta bronchial agonists, that kind of medication, exacerbation in the last 3 years, and of course consented onto the study. And the reason we could recruit a broad population onto that study and can do that even today is because we monitor safety remotely in almost real time. It meant, as an example, we could recruit, there were a couple of people on the studies who were HIV positive and some other unusual, not unusual, but other rarer diagnoses that would normally stop somebody from being recruited onto this kind of study. What that also does is it cuts down the number of visits during a study. So it helps to make a study more virtual. So typically in the Salford Lung study and studies we do now, there are just 2 visits, one which is the randomization visit and one is the end of study visit, whether that's visit 6 as traditionally called, or just early withdrawal from the study. To enable this kind of study, there has to be a community of care involved. And what I've got is, I've got some numbers from near the end of the COPD study to show you who was involved in this kind of study. So obviously 2,800 patients, 80 GP practices were recruiting to the studies. We got data from 146 pharmacies. That included chains, but also corner shops. And again, quite famously, there was a computer system in a garden shed that we managed to get the data out of that pharmacy system. We had 3,000 people trained as part of the study. And we collected over 235 million rows of data from the electronic medical record. In fact, over 85% of the final 50 analysis data sets were used data that was collected directly from the electronic medical record. So just move on quickly to second slide. This shows really where not just the Salford Lung study, but real world studies sit within the clinical evaluation life cycle. As you can see there, because these studies can work on pre-licensed drugs, it does span the efficacy and effectiveness, the clinical development and pharmacovigilance stages of a clinical trial. As you can see there, 15 years is typically the length of time to get a drug to market from discovery. It's a very long time and it's very, very expensive. In fact, these figures were taken from a few years ago from work done by the FDA on clinical trials. So these are pivotal trial costs. So they're usually larger scale phase 2B, phase 3 clinical trials. As you can see, the cost of trials is, well, it's enormous. It's quite scary, really, that obviously the more patients you recruit to a trial, the more expensive these trials are. But as you can see there, $77 million for a trial with more than 1,000 recruits. So it's very important to reduce the amount of time to market in a clinical trial and to just reduce the cost in the trial altogether. So we've got a feasibility and recruitment tool, and that's called Farsight. And Jonathan, do you want to carry on for a bit and talk about Farsight?
Yeah, sure.
And how we use it?
Absolutely. So as John pointed out, the drivers here are cost and time. And also, I think the third driver is accuracy of cohort. When you go into, I spent 30 years on the device and drug side before I came to the trial side. So a lot of my career has been on the customer side of this, trying to get products to market and to approval. And the things that are important, obviously, other than just cost and time, are getting a cohort of patients that you can rely upon. So you've got legs of the trial that are well powered with good data coming out. And this is where Farsight really helps. So this flow chart here kind of shows you how Farsight works. It's an acronym: Feasibility Recruitment System for Improving Trial Efficiency. So first of all, we do a study to understand if the patients really exist. And right now, I'm working with a large multinational CRO, and John and I have developed a study, a feasibility study for them based upon using the Farsight technology to understand if hard to access patients with amyloidosis really do exist in the UK. So we've taken our database based in Salford and in London. We work with Imperial College as well, so Northwest London, and we've analysed the data and extrapolated out to understand exactly how many patients fit in the UK with inclusionary and exclusionary criteria for this potential study. Now, this has saved the sponsor company weeks and months of heartache and a lot of expense a lot of the time, because we can go in there and run in under a week a complete analysis and then do an instant prevalent rate extrapolation for the UK market. And this allows a CRO working with and their customer real confidence to power up the study and get going. And as John pointed out, these studies cost a lot of money. In a 400, 500, 600 patient study, that's tens of millions of pounds. So investing the time and effort to understand the market before you actually go live on the study, and involving us early days in the building of the protocol, using Farsight to understand what inclusionary and exclusionary criteria might be important to you in that study, I think it really helps pharmaceutical and medical device companies get a leg up on studies right now. There's also, I think, a real understanding of what's going on with the COVID marketplace. COVID-19 has impacted the entire world in ways that we're not going to discuss here, but obviously palpable in significant ways. One of those vectors we need to consider is, what does societal data do and drive in terms of healthcare delivery and healthcare access? We've seen different cohorts in the UK alone react differently to the vaccines, react differently to the news of a vaccine, and react differently to COVID-19 if indeed they are unfortunate enough to catch COVID-19. So layering in data, not just the health record data, clinical record data, but looking at socioeconomic data and looking at, if your societal data and layering that on top, helps us better understand the impact of drugs and trials on different communities in the UK and indeed globally. And I think this will only become more important as time goes by, and as the lessons we've learned from the COVID pandemic become adopted into other clinical trials. I think also another key learning is that using AI and machine intelligence and really driving that drug discovery and development process means that time to market becomes compressed. And that puts more pressure on us to gather really good data and prove and demonstrate that these drugs are efficacious, that they're safe, that they can be used against certain indications. And that's where using a data set like Farsight, a system like this, where we work with trusts, we work with clinical event data, we understand the community practice down to the computer, the server in a shed, and up to working with a large university like Imperial. So we have that breadth and depth of understanding of the marketplace. And I think more companies will take that model on board and look at creating what we call nodes, where we have centres of excellence in a city like Salford, or indeed North London, an area like North London, where we can reach out to millions of patients and understand those data at the granular level, really prosecute those data and get down to an enriched and enhanced data set of possible candidates for inclusion into clinical studies. John, your thoughts and comments?
Yeah, good summary. I think, as you say, we've got the ability with Farsight to search the data, clinical record of millions of patients. As you said, we run trials in geographic centres of excellence that we call nodes, so you could call them other names. And you're right, machine learning then can supplement the search engine to try and find other variables of interest. It could be markers within the data that can help to recruit more patients to a study and find more patients for a study. Yeah. So I'll move on now to a couple of technologies we use to help to make trials more virtual, again to save costs, but also to generate more evidence, particularly safety evidence within the trial space. So here's a quick diagram of the usual data sources that get imported into data platforms for this purpose. As I've talked about before, we've got GP data, hospital data, either directly from a data warehouse or from the PASI EPR systems, pharmacy data out of hours, an ECRF to collect data that you can't readily capture still from within the electronic medical health record, national data sets. We're working on social care at the moment. And of course, everyone's talking about omics, wearables, AI. The model seems to be using AI and wearables to supplement the the medical record to try and predict indicators of things like exacerbations of asthma or COPD or other events of interest to try and preempt those kind of exacerbations and visits to hospital. So yeah, the two main areas I just want to finish on really is the remote safety alert system and study data management. If you think back to the slide I presented earlier, then the costs are quite extraordinary. $77 million sticks in the mind. Now, 15 to 25% of those costs can actually be site monitoring costs. So typically source data verification of data that's been keyed into an ECRF. So we want to try and reduce that wherever possible. So we've got the ability using source data to be able to use that to view the data remotely. So there are no site visits then by the CRA, or at least the CRA's visits are reduced. And a good reason for doing this, we saw in the pandemic, because during the pandemic, the sites themselves, the GP practices shut down. That paused clinical trials and actually risked some of the clinical trials from being shut down. So it's important to make these trials as virtual as possible. So we can view the electronic medical record remotely. We can restrict the access to that data to just consented patients as well, because the risk could be if somebody's at site and looks on the GP system, they can see data which is not consented. So I've just done some bullet points as well of why we use electronic healthcare records. We think it's more accurate. It creates double, in general, real world trials create double the amount of safety data from as opposed to a traditional clinical trial. Yeah, safety is processed in real time. And yeah, so some bullet points there. You can also then collect the long-term follow-up post-trial data of interest. Finally, I'm just going to quickly talk about the difference between safety monitoring and reporting in a standard RCT and that in a real-world trial. I think one of the main differences for me is that safety events and possible safety events, you no longer have to depend on patient recall. So typically in a clinical trial, on visit 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, the patient goes in to see the principal investigator who asks if there's been any issues. And the patient can say, well, no, I've been fine, but a month ago I did end up in A&E. So with this system, you can spot that event, that possible safety event, within minutes or hours. So famously, we had on one of our studies, we could see an adverse liver or kidney function test in the data. So our safety team phoned the hospital ward, and the hospital ward staff were unaware of that event. So the remote safety system saw that before the hospital staff were aware. It produces more evidence. It allows for less visits to the site by the patient on the trial, makes it more real world. So it's a great system that for generating evidence and reducing clinical trial costs. So I think to summarize, I think it's, if we use real world data, new technologies, AI, communities of care, then we can help to reduce trial costs and generate more evidence. That's my presentation done. I was done.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think we're going to move on to the next session, and then there'll be time for sort of 5 minutes of questions at the end of this first section. So I'm going to hand over to Manoj now, who's the founder and CEO at Clinion, which is an integrated e-clinical platform for clinical trial setup. So I think he's got 15 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of questions. So if any of the participants do have a question, then please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll come to you at the end of the session. Otherwise, I'm sure I'll have a few kind of things to get us started off with. So without further ado, over to you, Manoj. You are on mute.
Yes.
First one in the morning.
Thank you. Yeah. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. I'll be talking about largely about DCT, decentralized clinical trials, and I have a case study at the end, which I'd like to go through. So without further ado, I'll jump into it. Yeah. Can everyone see my screen? Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, so we're looking at decentralized clinical trials. It's a simple agenda, right? Introduction to DCT. Most of us are aware of what decentralized clinical trials are. You would call them decentralized or remote clinical trials or virtual clinical trials, but they all mean the same thing in today's world. How do you do a clinical trial with the patient who's not coming to the site but at his home? We've talked about real world evidence, so that's all part of what DCT has to offer. What are decentralized clinical trials and what do they offer? One is home monitoring. So this part of the presentation is something which most people are aware of, at least from the clinical trial world. I look at a few advantages which decentralized clinical trials have to offer. Okay, one is home monitoring. So there's ample evidence that home monitoring of subjects is better than having them come to the site, because the sites is an artificial atmosphere and they would be most comfortable at home, and we would have better results or more accurate, more authentic results. So decentralized clinical trials allows you to do that. The traditional clinical trial system has discrete data points. So the patient comes to the site, we get some data from him, and then there's some silence apart from maybe some ePro activity or a patient diary activity, but there's silence till the next visit. Whereas if you're looking at decentralized clinical trials, there's a lot of, since the patient is being monitored at home, there's continuous data which is flowing, which allows us to understand how the study is going much better. We have data directly from the source, from the patient. So this data tends to be more accurate. As long as the devices, the technology is good, the data tends to be more accurate than the data which you get from traditional studies. The advantages we've seen during studies during COVID-19, which has given a large impetus to decentralized clinical trials, is that we are able to access more diverse and large population. One is that the costs of patients coming to the site and monitoring all of that is reduced. So we're able to actually recruit a larger set of patients. We're also able to reach patients who would otherwise not be able to come to the sites. Data is directly entered into the system, so it comes into the entire clinical trial platform directly. There's no transcription from paper to an electronic form. So data loss, time, effort, all of that is saved. Since data is continuous, more accurate, the data is available electronically at any point of time, greater clinical insights can be drawn from this data. And in clinical trials, the buzz is that everything should be centered around the patient. In traditional clinical trials, there's an effort underway to make it more patient-centric, but decentralized clinical trials really pushes that, so that since all your processes, technologies, everything has to be centered around how do you service the patient, how do you do the trial when the patient is at home. This actually pushes that a lot more than traditional clinical trials. Finally, of course, less site visits, patients coming to the site, recruitment, all of those costs come down. Systems which help in remote clinical trials may be expensive, but the costs of the other costs, operational costs, will definitely come down. do definitely come down, and they do result in a lot of time and cost savings. What are some of the challenges we see? Decentralized clinical trials have been there for some time now. They're not new, but the challenge has been that how reliable are there, and really, can we depend on them? Can we do a large study on them? How authentic is the data, and so on and so forth? Some of those questions are addressed here, and the big challenge, COVID has put rest to a lot of those doubts, but there's still a long way to go. One is, of course, patient monitoring, right? Most clinicians, investigators, CROs, sponsors they are like, we don't see the patient, we can't, talk to them. We don't see them in person, but just like every other industry has transitioned to an online mode. For example, like banking, it's time for the clinical research industry also to transition that, where in which you're looking at a patient remotely only through a monitor, or talking to them through a video call. There are plenty of tools which allow you to take care of patient monitoring. So the thing is to trust the technology, and go for good technology and trust the technology. IP delivery, another challenge, because medication sometimes need to be given in person. Not everything is a pill, and they may have to be returned. They could be lost. So again, the challenge here is to tie up with a trusted partner who can integrate his systems into your system, so that you have complete transparency into the supply chain. Data privacy. This is again, if you talk to proper opponents of remote clinical trials, or anybody who is skeptical about it, they would be like, what do we do about data privacy? Use the data. But then if you look at the back industry, they've solved this problem a long time back, right? And it's no longer as much as a challenge as it used to be. There are occasional challenges, and that's expected of an industry. But this industry is going the same way as that. Safety and compliance. Now, this is more to do with the processes we have in place, the monitoring which we do. So there's constant monitoring, constant follow-up, constant checking, and also the trial should be set up in such a way that there's quick access to a patient. There should be systems, and there should be possibly sites or alternate sites available, so that some of these aspects can be addressed. Okay. Compliance actually goes up in remote clinical trials because of the number of patient engagement tools which are now in place. There are many ways in which you can engage a patient and make sure that he's more involved, and more involved with the study, and he continues to study. And dropout rates have reduced. If you look at remote clinical trials, there may not be enough studies to actually say for sure, but definitely remote clinical trials have shown lower dropout rates than traditional studies. Data analysis. Now, this is a critical component, and this needs to be planned ahead, because there's a lot of data which comes out of decentralized trials. So you have the traditional systems, your ePros, then you have wearables, then you have other electronic systems which are plugged in, and it could be the patient's phone, it could be some other device which is part of the study. It could be some data collection technique like a pacemaker possibly. So there's a lot of data which comes out of this, and this needs to be carefully monitored and analyzed. And this needs to be planned ahead of the study. Finally, the biggest challenge is regulatory acceptance. So if you look at the FDA has relaxed guidelines for during the COVID-19. The pandemic doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon, but if you're looking at what the regulatory stance would be subsequent to the pandemic, there would definitely be some changes from the traditional model. But however, what we need to keep in mind is that if the data which we gather from the remote clinical trial, is it of the same standard as a traditional trial? It has the same quality as a traditional trial. Then the FDA should not have a problem in accepting that data. Some of the trends in DCT. Okay, this is something which we've seen. So let's say if there's a patient, one is of course that there's a pure DCT is a long way off, or it may never happen because there are many trials which cannot work in a pure DCT mode. So the answer is definitely hybrid trials. Okay, so I will just run you through these. So, so a patient in a regular DCT or in a DCT, and this from our experience plus what we've seen is that, let's say he's interacting with a doctor online. He has a online appointment, online consultation. The doctor is talking to him. He's having various wearables, which gives a lot of data out. There's a support center which is talking to the patient on a regular basis, making sure that he's adhering, if he has any challenges, if he has any issues, addressing those concerns, right? Medication is being sent to him, being shipped to him direct to patient. And plus he has some, some software like an ePro or, any other software which he's entering forms, some forms which he's entering on a regular basis. Plus, whenever intervention is required, there's somebody who's reaching out to him or may go directly to the patient to take care of that. Now, this is what traditionally consists of DCT, but what we've seen is a mix and match of, traditional and, complete remote methods is what works and is what was working in most studies. So though the doctor may be talking to him online, there are times when the patient would need to visit the hospital, and that should be allowed. That it should be flexible enough. The trial design should be flexible enough to allow that. Wearables are good, but there are some patients who don't have the wearables. In that case, there must be an arrangement so that traditional methods of diagnosis, traditional method of investigation should be allowed. Because what happens is that you may depend on a patient to have some data. In terms of he would be more comfortable using his own phone or his own devices than some other device which you give to him. Similarly, in terms of medication, what we've seen is that we should give the flexibility to patients to collect the medicine. So either they can get it shipped, they have it shipped, or they should be able to visit a site and pick it up, or there should be a store nearby they can pick it up, right? So the comfort and of the patient is what is paramount. And if he is not comfortable using a tablet or a phone, smartphone, whatever, then they should be able to fill in forms which later get entered into an EDC. So the hybrid trials is what is very important. Next is BYOD versus provisioning. Traditionally, for the remote clinical trials, the sponsor used to provide devices for the patient to enter, but those weren't very successful because patients aren't very comfortable using multiple devices. They'd like to use their own phone. So it's more and more that patients just go to the app store, download an app and start entering data. And that's into their own phone, which is available to them because that's closest to them and they constantly look at it. So that's what it's moving to. It's no more provisioning anymore. Right? Now, patient engagement. One is how do you get patients more engaged? So there are more and more, the trend in patient engagement is that, of course, there's some reimbursement and some gift cards you provide. That's one. Plus, the patients are also asking for their data. So during the course of the trial or after the trial, we should be able to be in a position to give some data back to the patient so he can use that and improve his own lifestyle or understand how his own body is working. The next thing is that there's a lot of data which is being collected during the course of the study. Who does this data belong to? Of course, the patient, but right now that's a gray area. It's not being addressed, right? But that's definitely an area which needs to be looked into. Gamification. There are a few trials in which, if you look at a lot of other apps, health fitness apps, for example, they give you digital rewards for reaching some milestones. The same gamification translated to clinical trials also would enhance patient engagement and keep him more focused, more compliant with the study. Finally, there are many patients who look at undergoing a clinical trial just so that they can help society, they can give back, right? So if involving them in such initiatives, letting them know that their contribution is very important. Data intelligence, I'll just jump this because I don't think I have much time. I'll try and wrap it up as soon as possible. Data intelligence, we collect a lot of data, so this needs to be carefully planned and managed because a lot of valuable data can come in. At the same time, we need to be careful that there's so much of data that it doesn't translate, become noise. A case study, we had a phase 3 trial recently during the COVID time. We did a phase 3 trial to evaluate efficacy for COVID-19 treatment. So there were 12,000 patients, 6 sites. It was remote. It was a remote area in India. The challenges were that there was a lockdown going on. People couldn't move out. They couldn't visit the sites, of course. The locations were remote, not easy to access them, large sample size. And the biggest challenge was we had a very short FPI first patient in of 3 weeks. We had to get it up and running in 3 weeks' time. And of course, local language support was imperative. What we did, we integrated our ePro and our EDC solution, right? We built in an e-consent module so that patient e-consent can be taken remotely. He could sign in and give his consent. And so there was a support center which made sure that shipment and then there would patient recruitment, authentication, identification would take place. The ePro had multilingual support. Okay, we're able to put together all of this and deploy it in 3 weeks, so that in real time we could see that patient were entering data on a daily basis, and we could see the data as it was coming in, right? And the result. So we had 80% app usage. So it's about 10,000 subjects actually use the app, use the ePro e-patient diary to enter the data in multiple languages, right? The balance of them visited some sites, some filled physical forms. Okay, the dropout rate was only 5%, which was remarkable considering it was completely remote, right? We completed the study within stipulated 45 days, right? What worked was that basically that one was we had the multilingual support, the app which could be downloaded from the App Store. Okay, it was a short duration study, 45 days. So I think that worked for us. And there was flexibility in terms of how they could correct the medication. Okay, so multiple things worked, and the study was a success. Yeah, I'll stop now. Any questions? I guess we take them all at the end. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Manoj. Do we have any questions for anyone for either set of speakers? I know we've had one that was in the chat, but I think has already been answered. I will start us off. For Jonathan and John, I think you mentioned, so at Tech UK we represent a number of technology companies, but most of the major of the EPR providers as well. I was sort of wondering how have you kind of overcome some of the challenges in terms of, I suppose, working with those software providers and sort of accessing NHS data and sort of help the access to that sort of clinical, high value data that's held in the EPR system that you can kind of use for clinical research. How do you sort of see that developing in the future? And I suppose how have you kind of worked with some of those organisations to overcome those information governance challenges, interoperability challenges, those sorts of things?
I think I'll go first, Jonathan. That's okay. All right. It basically remains a challenge, very much a challenge to make sure that the governance is correct, that you're using data for the correct purpose that's been signed off and been agreed. If you've got consent for clinical trials, it does open the doors somewhat to access this data rather than research. On research pseudonymized type databases. But even then, if you've got consent from the patient, the lots of meetings, lots of building of trust with hospitals, with national data set providers, making sure that we comply to data standards, ISO 27001 as a good example of that. The new DPST, I always get that wrong. So complying to standards as well, going through the audits, making sure that everything is in order in-house, making sure that we've got security in place, that we can meet these standards, and also restricting the amount of identifiable data within the system as well. So you can restrict that to the very bare minimum within the systems to try and reduce the risk. but it is an ongoing issue. I personally, I prefer to work with GP data. There's now more of the hospital data within the GP system than say 10 years ago, better quality data. The hospitals are a bit inconsistent with how they store data. Some of it still is paper-based in some of the hospitals, which of course is then very difficult to use within clinical trials. It gives you further complexity. But national data sets are good quality. And we've, as I said, we've worked with hospitals. Many of the hospitals within Manchester are now more with Imperial in London. And it's making sure that the data is consistent between sites as well. So if it's a clinical trial, you need to be able to have the same quality of data from all the sites that participate within the clinical trial, really. But it is an ongoing challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to add to that, it's you have to strike partnerships and create value-added SLAs with data providers to have access to these data sources, and that can be a challenge. And we've gone through various iterations of trying to develop partnerships and manage those partnerships. And there's a team of people that work in my part of the business that help with John to try and provide those data links outside of our network, and that can be challenging. But I think, if you build those sort of partnerships with companies with like EMIS, like Apollo, database providers like that, there's ways to augment and enhance the data you get in, and make sure you've got rapid feed. And one of the unique offerings we have is the ability to turn around data in 24 hours or so. So for real world trials, it's important. Certainly COVID, for example, somebody tests positive, you want to get a patient into that cohort and that study quickly. You've got to identify them, you've got to consent them, you've got to get them moving really, really quickly. So the ability to turn data quickly from suppliers, the e-record quickly, and scan it and get it to the PI so that he or she can start to make those decisions is critical. And that's the core of really the flexibility of driving real world evidence trials.
I'm going to bring Karen Taylor in here from Deloitte to comment as well. Karen.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Tom. I've got a question first of all for John, and Jonathan, just carrying on from that train of thought about use of electronic health records, and the mention you made about primary care records being better. I think we've done a study on the digital transformation of healthcare in the UK and found that it wasn't actually that strong, the links, but I think it has improved during the last 12 months as a result of some of the relaxations that's in regulations that's happened with COVID. But I was just wondering, how do you handle the interoperability issue given the different electronic health records that are in place?
If I'm talking more technically, how we do it, and you're right, I think it's far from perfect, the GP data, but it certainly has improved from what I could see in the data five years ago, particularly the last couple of years. What we try and do is standardize everything we get, all the data, whether it's from primary care or from the hospital feeds or from national data sets, into a common coding system first, and we use SNOMED CT release format 2 for that. Again, there are mapping systems that exist, and NHS Digital provide those, but it's not just as easy as just downloading them and using them to map data. There's a lot more complexity to that. So we have a team of data scientists and statisticians who help with that work. Once we've normalized that data and curated that data to a certain extent, look for duplication within the data, particularly from data which is both in the primary and secondary care data. We can then start to format it into other data types, and because of what we do, we tend to categorize data into something called CDISC SDTM domains and variables, which are then used for analysis within a clinical trial. But it isn't an easy thing to do, that normalization of the data.
Thanks. My other question was more about the participants in the trial. One of the other observations doing our Closing the Digital Gap report was the reluctance of clinicians to adopt technology in their interface with patients. but also more importantly, patients themselves who were reluctant to use technology. Now, again, I know this has changed during COVID, but I just wondered how you addressed not just the reluctance, but in some cases the lack of digital literacy or health literacy in the participants. How do you deal with that? And I think that could also I could also ask that of Manoj.
Yeah, I think again I'll just briefly answer about the patients. I think and within Salford in particular and Manchester, yeah, it's not. You would think most people have got mobile phones these days and a high level of technical sort of expertise, and that's far from the case, particularly in some of the areas in Manchester. But I think the model we've got of these communities of care within geographical areas with GPs who really do want to be involved in research. We try and provide them technology that makes it easier for them. And we've got a community team as well. It isn't just technology that helps to recruit patients. As I said, for some of our studies, we've been able to recruit people you wouldn't normally be able to recruit into studies because they've got a lot of comorbidities, as an example, particularly in the COPD study we did. So I think it's almost like what I'm trying to say is a joint effort between the technology and the community of care, really, to help in recruiting patients.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, we have such a strong network of community nurses and CRAs that we leverage. There's a whole dedicated team that works in our business. And I think those men and women, the relationships they have with the clinicians within certainly the Salford area, Greater Manchester area, and in Northwest London also, allow us to kind of bridge that barrier and hold people's hands if there is a bit of sensitivity or a little bit of a learning curve or adoption curve lag behind using technology. And I think those relationships are key. And also with honorary contracts, we can go in there and help bring these people up to speed and bring these clinics along with us for the journey. And I think, again, being discerning and being selective in where we do place trials, place business, if you will, finding clinicians who are up for the game or who know people who would like to get involved and really understand what that means in terms of time and effort and resource deployment. That's really key. I think the site has to understand the burden they're taking on when they're engaging in a trial. And we offer with our community team an extensive support, so we can be as involved or as hands-off as that clinician wants us to be. And I think that flexibility is key to engaging and retaining interest for the length of the trial.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Manoj, what about you in terms of that patient engagement and support?
Yeah. So the common perception or the what people would say is that COVID-19 has actually changed people's perception about patient engagement, patient wanting to not visit the site. But a recent study which in an Informa webinar which I was in said that the number of patients who wanted to do remote versus the number of patients who want to do remote pre and post COVID are the same. I mean, it's not really changed. Patients still want to go back to the site. But it's more of that there is no other option that they have to be remote or can do remote clinical trials, and it's the same with the clinicians, and it's working as well. As you see, of course, a lot of studies have been put on hold. They're slowly coming back as CROs are transitioning to a digital mode, a more digital mode, and clinicians see that it's working and that they have no option but to move. And it's the same with the patients, that they're actually, even though they may not be too comfortable using technology or maybe not visiting sites, but since there's no other option, they're having to do it.
Thanks very much, everyone. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of bring things to a close for this first section here and move on, given that we have sort of 2 additional areas to cover. However, if you do have a question that hasn't been answered, put it in the chat, and hopefully the panelists from the previous session will kind of be able to respond in text. I think if we have time at the end, we'll be able to come to you. So I'm next going to call on Dr. Steve McConchie, Dr. Anthony Wilson, and Anthony Bashall. Anthony Wilson is a consultant in anaesthesia and intensive care medicine at Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust. Anthony Bashall, or Tony, is Managing Director and founder of Zenzium Limited. Dr. Steve is CEO and co-founder of Aptus Clinical, which is a full-service CRO. Over to you guys.
Thanks. Can everyone see the screen okay?
Yep, I can see it if you bring it, I suppose, if you full screen.
Yeah, just let me get it to full screen. Is that, can everyone see that okay? If I do, sorry, view. Can everyone see the slides now? Thanks for the introduction, Tom. So we're just going to spend a few minutes talking about the COSMIC-19 study, which is a study ongoing within Manchester, sponsored by Innovate UK and the Christie Charitable Foundation. So just to give you a bit of a background about the collaboration, there was something that was set up by Innovate UK in 2018 called the Innovate Manchester Advanced Therapy Centre Hub. This is part of a broader three national centres that were set up by Innovate UK, really to focus on supporting the development, adoption and deployment of cell and gene therapies, advanced medicinal therapeutic products into the NHS. It's an academic industrial collaboration that's been going on for about 3 years. And within Manchester, these are the industrial and academic and clinical partners that are involved in Manchester. And it was really the vision for IMatch is to make the running of clinical trials with cell and gene therapies as normal as running typical cell and gene therapy as typical studies. Obviously, cell and gene therapy studies create a number of challenges, and it's really about, through partnership, learning best practice and so on, that we're trying to actually improve the adoption and the delivery of cell and gene therapy trials in the NHS. So Tony, shall I hand over to you now to talk a little bit about the AI?
Sure, that's great. Thanks, Steve. Okay, so to set the stage, let's think about what AI is, and then move on to think about how we incorporated that in the COSMIC-19 trial. So we've got a number of drivers out there, and those drivers are all saying we need to do something. We need to do something quickly. And I think in the context of COVID, all COVID has done is just exacerbate all of these drivers and made them more apparent and more of a problem. I'm not going to go through all of them, but everybody knows Eroom's law, which is Moore's law spelled backwards. And that is, that the cost of developing a drug, bringing it to market, increases 2 times every 9 years. One of the other interesting things to think about is we talk a lot about digital how we can get EHR more established in the hospitals. But this is a recent figure from the US that says physicians are now spending 2 times the amount of time over clinical on entering data into EHR systems. So it has its problems. The amount of data which we're generating in healthcare is doubling every 73 days. And then everybody knows, chronic diseases, the number of people over 65. One interesting statistic which has increased from 7x to 10x is the growth of telehealth. And that is, I think, as a direct result of COVID. So we think about digital transformation, we think about wearables. Both of those are going to be driving more and more data. And we know that humans really can't interpret vast amounts of data as well as we can with computers, and more specifically with AI. So what does AI mean? What is AI? So I'd like to propose just a very simple definition, and AI is prediction. So we can predict things a lot better using AI. If we're making decisions, whether those decisions are clinical decisions, business decisions, logistics decisions, they are formed of two components. Those two components are prediction and judgment. Humans are very, very good at judgment. Computers, AI are much better at prediction. So by phasing those two together, we can get better outcomes. So I think that's a fundamental thing. The other fundamental thing is that AI is not something you do to data. I can't tell you the number of discussions I've had where people have said, we've got this data, can you look at it with AI? AI is not this activity that you do to data. It has to be inherent in the study design, in the question you're trying to answer right from the beginning. And that, I think, is a very key learning which transcends most industries and also clinical trials, healthcare. It is this thing that has to be woven into the fabric of everything we're doing. So if we look in the middle at the discovery, development and implementation, which is basically the AI roadmap, one of the key things to realize is that AI is a little bit different than statistics. In other words, statistics is deterministic and AI is probabilistic. So that first discovery phase is very much akin to what we think about in the pharmaceutical arena. It's discovery. We wouldn't put the constraints of a phase 3 clinical trial in discovery. So we shouldn't put the constraints of the way we handle data into the discovery phase of AI. So it is a discrete initial process that we go through, and it's highly iterative, which is one of the other things I think a lot of people don't realize is the iterative nature of how we get the data in, how we look at it, how we do data munging, how we build models, and then ultimately how we implement it. It's not the old waterfall type of strategy moving forward. It's the agile, it's iterative, it's circular, there's a lot of feedback. So the models we're trying to create are going to do different things. Those models are going to be decision support. They're going to be software as a medical device. They're going to be digital diagnostics or digital therapeutics. So that's the outcome. The other key thing is that AI is very data-driven. So we have to get the data to be able to get the results. And I think that is another paradigm shift in a lot of thought processes around clinical trials, where we have the data and then we manage the data. Here we have to acquire the data, iterative look and see how that data is being used, feed that back in, and then get more data, different types of data, different contexts, and put that into the model. So really what we think about having is an AI process. So that AI process is not something which is just doing AI. It's in whole, looking at the entire process. So first of all, what question are we trying to answer? What's the problem? How does that relate to the data we're trying to obtain? And that is iterative backwards and forwards. Then we do data munging. We clean the data. Do we have the right tools? And then move on to modeling. Have we modeled that data? Do we then go back and get more data of a different kind? And then move on to evaluation of that data. So this cyclic process is very important. And this is something we've adopted, and this is based on CRISP-DM, which is the cross-industry standard process for data mining. We've iterated that and we made it more AI-ish, and we can implement that in a lot of things that we're talking about. Currently, we've got over 6 studies, and this is just one of them. And it's important to realize that you have to have a process. You can't just go in here and figure out what to do on the fly ad hoc. And then we've got a balance between some of the attributes. You know, are we looking at a class 2, class 1 medical device, or are we looking at a consumer device? We're working currently with the regulators, and we're thinking about now, is the information from a longitudinal time series data gathering perspective more important than an episodic accurate measurement? We've talked a little bit about the waterfall to agile, and clearly AI is very agile. We have to iterate. The privacy concerns are also interesting. We obviously have GDPR, privacy concerns, but I've been to recently a couple of foundations and charities, and I've been asked by patients, not why are you using my data, but why are you not using my data? If the data can give a better outcome, can help me, yes, go ahead and use it. So I think that maybe has changed over the last 12 months. I think people are now more willing to provide their data if we can give them benefits from that data and improve their outcomes. So let's have a look about how this sort of iterated into the Cosmic 19. Next slide, Steve. So we're talking about using time series deep learning. So that's pretty much what the AI is about. We're taking temporal features, i.e. time-based, we're taking spatial features, and we're taking metadata features. So all of those are taken from recording vital signs, recording diagnostics, EHR systems, clinically reported outcomes. All of that is aggregated together. And we apply that data capture over the entire patient journey. So the patient obviously begins with admission to a hospital, then may get put into a ward. From the ward, they may move to an ICU. From an ICU, they may iterate back to a ward, and so on and so forth. So if we think in terms of the context of that patient journey, we'll be collecting data throughout that process. And that data is going to be acquired at different frequencies, which brings a consistent challenge for any deep learning AI system is how do we handle data coming in continuously, minute, sub-minute, episodically, once a week, once a month, routine, once every 2 hours, informative, which means a clinician makes a decision, I need this test now, whereas another clinician may decide he doesn't need the test. So that informative sampling throws a spanner into some of the works when we talk about deep learning, and also the metadata. Metadata is totally static. So how do we integrate all of that data together? So we've been developing a database, which is actually 6 separate databases. We're using a FHIR server in there and other technologies to be able to process that data. We're using ensemble approaches, which is different algorithms, different models put together. And out of that, we generate AI. And from that AI comes the model. And we iterate that backwards and forwards. We take that model back into the database. We look at the data we've got. We go around another iterative process. So leaving you with a patient journey, we're taking information at different frequencies. We're putting that into an algorithm to generate a model, validating that model by going back to the data and reiterating again. So Anthony, over to you. Let's talk about how we actually implemented it in Cosmic.
Thanks, Tony. That's great. Yes, so Tony's given us a detail about the AI part of the Cosmic 19 trial, and I wanted to really just fill you in on some of the background about the study itself and what we were hoping to achieve. Cosmic 19 stands for Continuous Signs Monitoring in COVID-19. We had an opportunity at the middle of last year to see if we could monitor patients in a ward-based environment who had COVID-19 using a raft of Bluetooth wearable sensors manufactured by a company called Isansis. And you can see some pictures of the sort of wearable sensors that we were hoping to use there that give us a sort of suite of vital signs and Bluetooth into a tablet that sits at the end of a patient's bed. This is a CE marked system, and it's been sort of validated for use in sort of ward environments. But what we wanted to do was to sort of put it through its paces in a tough environment, really. A hospital ward in the middle of a pandemic, when there was issues concerning infection control, wards being much busier than they were normally. And we wanted to see if this sort of system could actually allow us to monitor patients accurately. Because as Tony sort of briefly alluded to, the quality of the AI algorithm really depends on the quality of the data you can get. So that the more of it that you can get through sort of continuous monitoring in a ward environment helps. But also we need to know that it was actually able to do its job and that these devices function practically. So we wanted to sort of query that and then to go on to use this data in conjunction to the other things that Tony's described to predict deterioration and predict recovery in patients that were suffering from COVID-19. And going along with that, really, there's a piece of practical learning that we were hoping to do as well. Practical learning about, you know, how these devices function in a sort of normal workflow on a hospital ward. Because ultimately, if we're going to put these into practice in a bigger scale, nurses and doctors working in that ward environment need to feel comfortable with this technology. They need to understand what to do if the devices drop off. We need to understand how often that happens. So all this practical learning and ways about automating how we extract the data from this system was part of what we were hoping to achieve with COSMIC-19. Now, we were very fortunate that the idea to enrolment for the trial was 4 months, and that's a really fast turnaround, and it's testament to our project partners and testament really to the fact that we'd been sort of pump priming and planning a trial like this in advance of COVID-19. So we had an idea to use this technology as part of IMATCH in the Advanced Cell Therapy group to look at patients having treatment for hematological malignancy. And so when COVID arrived, we were fortunate that our relationship with our funders, Innovate UK, was such that we could say, well, actually, we've got an idea of how we can pivot this and use this technology for good during COVID. And this is how the trial came about. So the pump priming and the preparation that we'd done allowed us to be quite agile in an NHS environment. And so far, we've recruited, you know, I think actually nearly 3/4 now of the patients that we've planned. We've managed to integrate our system with the hospital IT, which is no mean feat. And we've also managed to automate some of the metadata and the routine healthcare data collection to go along with the trial and to feed into the databases that Tony was describing to you. So Steve, we'll move on to the next slide if we can, please, because what I really wanted to do was just to highlight for the audience some of the things that I think that the learnings that we've got from COSMIC-19 and the things that I think are key for AI and wearable device trials that are being delivered in a sort of hospital NHS setting. So I think the first one is this whole concept of a collaboration in waiting. The fact that we'd pump primed and that we'd got ready to do this and that we had a good relationship with our funder and a good relationship between the NHS partners and the sort of SMEs that were involved in our project was really, really important. And so I would say that for the clinicians in the audience, that actually, although at the beginning, perhaps when we first had our meetings between the different partners, we didn't understand exactly what trial we were going to do or where we were going to go with this. Those meetings had value because they built that relationship and it meant that we were able to move swiftly when we needed to do. I think for people that are trying to reach into the NHS and to do trials using data and using new technology in a healthcare setting, finding the right clinician is really important. And so, I mean, I think we were lucky in COSMIC-19 that we had myself and other clinicians involved who I would describe as clinical informaticists, clinicians who have got a real interest in how we can use electronically collected healthcare data to the benefit of patients. Because I think that means that you're more likely to be able to navigate the hospital system and the structures within the hospital to get access to the things you need to. And for us, that was apparent in how easy it was to gain hospital IT support. Having a personal relationship with the guy who sort of is our hospital IT server manager meant that it was easy to phone up and get the server upgrades that we needed to run this system through our sort of hospital informatics network. Also, the observational design of COSMIC-19 was important. I think had we tried to replace routine care with a new technology from the outset, it would have been very difficult to overcome some of the governance hurdles that are there and are appropriate in a hospital setting. So we very much use this technology in an observational setting. We didn't alter routine care at this stage, because what we saw was that the first thing to do was to get the technology into the hospital and get it being used. And by saying that we weren't going to have an impact on routine care and alter clinical care pathways, it was much easier to do that. We had a very resourceful team of research nurses, but I would highlight this as being an area where potentially some extra training needs to be invested too. So many of our research nurse team are very familiar with delivering a sort of a clinical interventional trial with drugs and these kind of things. But the idea of using technology and some of the sort of the challenges that they had to do to set that technology up on a ward to make sure that it was working properly and connected appropriately were quite new to them. And I would say that we benefited having from a couple that were really resourceful, but that's really a training need, both for any future trials that need to be done. And we need to think about how our research nurses are trained in that regard. And also then how they champion that training to the rest of the sort of community of nurses that are working on the wards. And lastly, one of the things that COVID really led to was virtual trial meetings. So the majority of our trials meetings were conducted virtually using MS Teams and Zoom. And that meant that things were much more efficient in terms of setting up and managing some of the sort of the bureaucracy and the sort of logistics of organising the trial. So I think that's most of the things that I wanted to add about it, but I'd stop there and hand over to any questions.
Thanks very much. I think what we're going to do is ask for questions kind of be posted in the chat so we can kind of move on with the presentations, as I think we're a little bit behind time. And so now I'm going to introduce Karen from Deloitte, who spoke earlier, but she's the Research Director for Deloitte's UK Centre for Health Solutions and has been in post there since December 2011. Karen, over to you.
Just checking you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. And good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to present a very high-level overview of our research that led us to do a series of reports on the role of AI in transforming the biopharma value chain. So I'm just briefly going to touch on a report we've done for 10 years now that looks at measuring the return from pharma innovation and the return on investment for that companies, and we're talking here about the large pharma companies are seeing, and then briefly discuss some of the use cases of AI in both drug discovery and clinical trials. So what we've been seeing through our report measuring the return from pharma innovation is that there's been a steady decline in the return on investment, as seen from the amount of money that is spent on funding research and clinical development, and then the expected revenue you can achieve on launch from selling those drugs. And as you can see here, the decline in return on investment has been quite alarming for both the original cohort of the top 12 pharma companies by spend on research and development, which is the green line. And then we added in 2013 some smaller but more agile companies who were focusing on a narrower range of therapy areas. And whilst they enjoyed very much higher rates of return in the earlier days that they were involved in our research, we have seen their return on investment decline as well, as they've actually become more like the big companies in our cohort. But overall, what you see is the cost of clinical trials, and we've already discussed it, increasing from 1.2 billion to 2 billion in those 10 years, and the expected revenue that could be achieved on average per asset halving. And we go into lots of reasons why that is, but what it shows is that the model of R&D is generally broken. One of the biggest drivers of cost is the length of clinical trials, and it's already been alluded to here. But on average, the clinical trial cycle times have been increasing, and it's particularly the case for oncology. And on the other side of it, oncology is making up an increasing percentage of the pipeline of the companies in our cohort. So that combination of increasing length of clinical trials, and that's despite an increasing number of assets having special designation, which are intended, those early access programs to get drugs to patients more quickly. But all of these things are why something needed to change. So we set off on this series of reports that looked at the intelligent clinical trials, intelligent drug discovery, but we did an overview report as well that looked at some of those cross-cutting themes. And I already mentioned interoperability and data and the role of data in being able to apply AI. And we cover them in our overview report. But because of the time available today, I'm just going to focus on drug discovery and again, at a very high level, and clinical trials, and then finish with just looking at what this might mean for the future. So in drug discovery, which hasn't really been touched on, but is that very first stage of the clinical development process, it can reduce the timelines for drug discovery. And there are some examples that we feature in our reports and case examples where drug discovery has been reduced to a matter of weeks rather than years. The average time for drug discovery is about 5 to 6 years. AI has the potential to reduce that time, potential to increase the accuracy of the predictions about the efficacy and safety of drugs, which will then have a benefit during clinical trials itself. So many drugs fail clinical trials due to the efficacy and safety issues, but because of the increased insights from using AI in drug discovery, you can have more certainty over whether or not they will be likely to fail the clinical trial. And then the improved opportunity to diversify drug pipelines. AI-enabled prediction tools improving speed and precision of discovery and of preclinical testing and opening up new research lines. And we've seen that coming to the fore during the past 12 months or so in repurposing drugs for COVID that had been developed and approved for other uses. And of course, that applies to many other therapy areas. And then the traditional approach to clinical development. Said it's a lengthy process. We've heard that from other speakers today. But on average, it's 10 to 12 years. And only about 10% of drugs that enter clinical trials actually end up being approved for use in the patient population. So in our report on the use of AI in drug discovery, we have examples at each of the phases of how AI can help improve the speed and accuracy of these phases. But again, I can't discuss them in detail because we don't have time. But the cost drivers of clinical trials, and we've again heard other presenters mention patient recruitment. Patient recruitment is there, that's the biggest cost driver. Outsourcing costs are the next biggest, and then as you just go around that circle, site recruitment, clinical trial management, site retention, because not only can we lose patients from trials, but we can also lose sites, data management and validation, and of course, patient retention. So this is analysis of lots of different secondary research reports on the cost drivers of clinical trials. So the winds of change, using AI to design the clinical trials of the future. The future is with us, as we've been hearing, but this is at scale. And in order to adopt clinical AI-enabled technology, there are a number of barriers that do need to be overcome. But the benefits will be in optimizing patient and site selection and recruitment, improving the efficiency and cost effectiveness of the trial process, but also optimizing the design and startup and closeout of trials, and that documentation that needs to go alongside the running of a clinical trial that can be very complex to pull together. And that often does delay the trial because of being able to satisfy the regulator with enough evidence of safety and efficacy. So improving the quality and process of dossier submission is also a role for AI. And then, as we've heard, improving patient engagement, adherence, and dropouts through the use of AI, which is what previous speakers have focused on. But all of these options can really improve the length of clinical trials. And whilst the vaccine development is a specific case in point, there has been a lot of collaboration to bring data together to enable some of these technologies to be applied to help speed up that process. So the applications of AI across the different phases of trial design and execution are in all of these spaces here. from advanced data analytics and AI automation across trial design, startup, conduct, and closeout, but also in that patient engagement, patient monitoring, patient support. So all of these areas have the potential to benefit from the use of AI technologies. But I'd like to stress that it's not about the technology per se, it's about change management in adopting these technologies to change the way that trials are conducted and the way that they are viewed as part of this ecosystem. So in terms of the future of biopharma over the next decade, a lot, as we say in our drug discovery report, still 90% of the drugs in the pipeline are small molecules, and they are less complex than the biologics and that we are seeing increasingly. And when I talked about cancer in clinical trials, they tend much more to be in the biologic space, and they're the ones that are more complex and therefore are driving the length of trials. But R&D costs will shift from that traditional discovery, which takes up about a quarter to a third of costs, to execution and to a process driven by large data sets. Scientific breakthroughs as a result of the insights gained by applying AI to all of this data that's been talked about will also help improve that our discovery and the new science as we go through the next few years. And then, of course, the importance of advanced analytics. I'm going to finish on a report we published at the end of last year, which was done during, as I say, during the last 3 months of the year. So the impact of COVID was pretty well known by then. So, and we looked at what was happening in clinical trials. And our prediction is that in 5 years, companies will have reversed the decline in the returns from pharma R&D. The advanced AI analytics and AI-enabled technologies will have accelerated drug discovery and clinical trials and improved the efficiency and efficacy of trial design and satisfying the regulators as well as reducing costs. It does require some of the some barriers to be overcome, and some of the barriers that need to be addressed, and they cut across all our predictions, are the need for new skills and talent. And we heard a mention of the importance of having clinical informaticians. The same is true of pharma companies having data scientists and other technology-enabled skill sets. And actually scientists becoming not just very adept at the science, but also at the data side of things. So pharma R&D processes are augmented through digital platforms enabled by access to fair data systems and processes and signing up to those standards that are really important here. The research partnerships with academia and digital tech companies driven by leaders with digital skills and a fail early, fail fast mindset, which is not something that has been a real feature of clinical trial design in the past. So that digital leadership, that digital skill sets are really important at the board level, and AI-enabled skill sets as well. AI for drug discovery companies is something that have grown significantly over the last 4 or 5 years. And they're different to previous companies who support the clinical trial processes in that they don't necessarily want to just help discover a new drug and then be acquired and move on to the next company. They actually want to see and be partners to the clinical trial process throughout the clinical development. We've seen a real increase in the number of AI for drug discovery companies. When we did our intelligent drug discovery report, there were about 170 registered. There are now over 300 and growing. And they bring a particularly adept skill set into this whole equation. But pharma companies employing those data-rich visualization tools we've already heard about in our case examples this morning, and developing hub and spoke command centers to operate virtual clinical trials. And of course, the importance of wearables, e-consent platforms and telehealth, which are not just transforming healthcare, but will transform the clinical trials of the future. I'll just say a little bit about regulation. I mentioned skills and talent as being both an enabler of the future, but a barrier that needs to be overcome. The other two are new business and financial models, because different ways of funding the whole process of clinical trials is critical. but also a new regulatory paradigm. And finally, a digital data sharing and security and interoperability issues. But not a lot has been said so far this morning about regulation. So as I say, regulation runs across all of our predictions, but in terms of achieving this particular prediction, the future of regulation requires rapid changes to the regulatory response. And we've seen that during COVID. It's created new relationships with regulators and pharma companies. Academia and the role of academia has also come to the fore. And so these partnerships and collaborations are, for me, one of the most important developments we've seen during COVID. And we heard that in our last presentation, that impressive collaboration that we've seen in Manchester. So I'm going to finish here, but again, mention that in our predictions reports, we do have case examples of how companies are already using and pushing at the forefront of the use of AI in clinical trials and the digital transformation of clinical drug discovery and development. And these are just two examples from our report. And as I've said, you've heard some today. But in terms of COVID, I just want to mention 23andMe and the way that it pivoted its research platform to identify a number of genetic and non-genetic associations for susceptibility and severity to COVID-19. And in less than 4 months was able to recruit 1 million of their customers, consented to participate in the research. And I'd like to echo what we've already been said, that patients are willing to participate in trials if they know about them and are given the opportunity. And all too often in the past, it's knowing about them and having that opportunity. But the other final input thing I'll say is feeding back to patients the results of clinical trials. Having this very much data-driven approach allows you to have the bespoke reports that you can feed back to the patients to encourage further participation in clinical trials. I'm going to leave it there, but I've covered quite a lot of reports in that, and all the reports are available on our website. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Karen. I believe we now have a poll, a kind of audience poll ready to go, which if you could vote on that, and then we're going to move on to our final speaker for the day, who is Adrian Tujungi, who is a partner for Taylor Wessing. So if you vote in that poll, and then I'll hand over to Adrian. So do you have any form of AI already implemented in the clinical systems you use? Yes, 26%, no, 61%, 13% don't know. Interesting, what we can take away from that. Adrian.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I'm just going to bring up my presentation. Right. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to speak to you. We've got 5 minutes, I think, at the end of the session. I'll keep my remarks to that, or try to. And this is picking up on what Karen has just been talking about, the regulatory aspect. In particular, what changes have we seen over the last 12 months since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic? And to the extent we can, how has that changed the regulatory environment and the willingness by regulators to accept into the clinical trial paradigm and embed within GCP the types of technology that we've been talking about? So very quickly, I think the first slide I've got is looking at clinical trial authorization. And just some of the key developments we've seen over the last 12 months here in terms of trial setup and authorization. So here in the UK, the Health Research Authority back in March 2020 very quickly responded to the pandemic outbreak here in the UK and established a regulatory fast track approval, both for Research Ethics Committee approval and research approval within the NHS. Studies which, following an element of pre-screening, were classified as urgent public health studies were going to be approved or reviewed within 24 hours, and then given the go-ahead or otherwise. And then there were some other priority topics which have been updated continually in the last 12 months. So initially there were various criteria. They were reviewed within a 36 to 72 hour time frame. Those current priority topics involve things like vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics for COVID, so studies relating to those, studies also relating to prevalence and transmissibility, and I think studies relating to aspects of the immune system as well. So those are the current priority topics where you can get that type of fast track approval. MHRA, as regards clinical trials of investigation medicinal products, again, back in March 2020, put forward a fast track. In effect, they were going to prioritize review and approval of trials which were involved in COVID-19. The Commission, obviously the EMA had been doing similar things, and we don't have time in the slot that's available to me to look in detail at what the EMA and the FDA were doing in parallel, but they were going through a very similar process. Interestingly, for those of you who are involved in cell and gene therapy, as one of the presenters was talking about earlier, and in particular also vaccine trials as well, where there may be viral vectors involved. In July 2020, the European legislator came up with a new regulation, which again removed some regulatory barriers, some of the difficulties caused by the GMO legislation here in Europe to trial initiation, particularly for vaccines and other types of gene-modified cell therapy, were disapplied for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic or public health emergency. This regulatory flexibility and speed of response allowed over 200 trials to be initiated between March and April 2020, according to the data in EudraCT, and the number of clinical trials has clearly grown significantly since then. And this has been a successful and popular fast track approach. Our contacts within clinicians and I think more widely throughout the CT sector have thought that this is a scheme that they want to try and keep to the extent it can be resourced and staffed appropriately by the regulators. If we look at the impact of the pandemic on the management of ongoing clinical trials, so at the time of the outbreak, there were approximately 4,000 non-COVID-19 trials underway. And patient organizations have reported that there was considerable alarm and concern among the trial subjects for a number of reasons. Clearly, lockdown rules meant that in principle, it was unlawful for patients to do site visits. Access to hospitals themselves were not allowing patients in to prevent transmission. It was possible that your PI became ill and had to go off, self-isolate, couldn't take part in the trial any longer. Staff, both in terms of clinicians and nurses, were being redeployed to the front line. Lab capacity was being, wherever possible, diverted to help with diagnostics. And there had been significant supply chain disruption for the medicinal product itself, and in particular, where that involved cross-border supply chains, the closing down of flights, the requirement for logistics drivers to self-isolate when they cross borders, that all meant that it was quite difficult to ensure that you had your trial supplies in the right place at the right time. The regulators that we've talked about, the MHRA, the HRA, the Human Tissue Authority as well, and then the European EMA and the FDA, all produced guidance in very short order on what sponsors and host organizations, PIs as well, should do in terms of managing trials. They've all shown a lot of flexibility, and in some cases, actually, they've regulatory forbearance or regulatory lenience to say that they'll exercise discretion not to enforce powers in certain circumstances. That guidance has been updated continually over the last 12 months as the situation has evolved. And most of the guidance documents are expressly marked as temporary. So when we speculate how much of the approach that we've seen over the last 12 months will remain in place when the pandemic comes to an end, that is at the moment speculation. But I think what we can say is regulators have been forced to show a lot of willingness and engage with some of the technologies we've been talking about today. And through that familiarity and through that contact, they would have built familiarity. And it's inevitable that they will be much more receptive to those type of technologies going forward. Safety of trial subjects throughout has been the priority. Data integrity, of course, is still important, data quality, but the priority has been safety of patients and in enabling patients to continue in trials particularly where the trial is in many cases the only hope for the patient. If we look in a bit more detail at what some of the guidance has suggested that hosts and PIs should be doing, generally speaking, that there was a four-prong approach. The options were to halt recruitment into a trial, so pause the trial, continue the trial, but with appropriate risk mitigation, which normally involve different approaches to delivery. And this is where we link back to Manoj's presentation and what John McRae was saying earlier about decentralized clinical trials. Now, some of this is pretty low tech, replacing hospital visits with tele or video consultations. That doesn't really touch on AI or some of the technology platforms we've been talking about earlier. Assessments, so you can do your testing, your lab tests using outside labs where there's capacity available rather than hospital labs, supplying the trial drug to the trial subject at home or increasing pack size. So again, all of that would clearly be subject to an assessment of, is it the type of drug that can be self-administered? Are there any cold chain requirements? Is it a controlled substance? So does it need to be tracked from a sort of chain of custody point of view and recovered to the extent it's not administered? All of those issues would need to be assessed as part of the risk mitigation, but the regulator was in principle open to the trial protocol being amended in those regards. And then clearly you have to bring your paperwork up to date. So in many cases, amendments had to be submitted, but most of the changes the regulators were willing to view as non-substantial. Again, that interesting to see whether that categorization would continue after the end of the pandemic. But what that meant was, whilst they had to be filed, they didn't need to be pre-approved before they could be implemented. And then the other two options were obviously to stop or suspend the trial. I think the data that we've seen, and anecdotally, that didn't happen to a great extent, particularly between March and May 2020. There were some trials which were stopped, but then they were restarted. I think the number of trials which completely fell over, certainly when I think about sort of industry-sponsored trials, and particularly those sponsored by the biotech sector, where I spend a lot of my time and where a lot of my clients are, they reported that their biggest concern was that just the duration of the trial was going to be pushed out rather than that the trial was going to be completely cancelled. From a sponsor's point of view, some of the questions have been picking up these questions about monitoring, audit obligations, also remote source data verification. How could that be done? And interestingly, we saw an evolution in some of the regulatory guidance that came out, particularly around things like source data verification, where initially, and if I just flip on to my last slide, initially the EMA was only willing to consider that for trials related to COVID-19 or serious or life-threatening conditions where they lacked other treatment options. And then 6 months later, they updated their guidance to be a lot more permissive about remote source data verification. And clearly, from a regulatory point of view and a GDPR point of view, there are still concerns, in particular about is the particular data to which the sponsor or the monitor is being given access, has it been appropriately anonymized? Has it been appropriately consented? Those type of issues remain to the fore, but the EMA was even willing to say that they, in principle, as long as they've got the right contract clauses in place, they don't mind somebody having access even from outside the EU or the EEA to data within the EU. So that sort of traditional red flag about cross-border data transfers, that they were willing to allow that type of access. But again, there was quite a lot of guidance around how you can do this in practice. You're not allowed to take screenshots. If you access the patient records, then are they appropriately anonymized so the sponsor's not seeing the identity of the patient? Quite a lot of guidance was given around there. And so I'll just finish with the thought about, well, what will the regulatory legacy be? It's difficult to say. I think, as I say, quite a lot of the amendments to trials which have been done on the hoof have been quite low tech. But clearly, some of the trials which have been started from scratch for COVID-19, as we've been hearing, have involved much more significant advances in technology. The regulator over the last 12 months will have been immersed in those. And I think we can expect to see a continued flexibility and continued willingness, particularly pushed by industry and clinicians in both regards. I think the regulator will be willing to continue to see those technologies employed in clinical trials work, and they won't require a return to the status quo ante. and I'll draw stumps at that point. Finish my remarks there.
Thank you very much, Adrian. That was really great. Do we have any questions? Any sort of questions that have either been unanswered or that people would like to raise off the back of that? I think we are a little bit over time, so I'm sort of somewhat loath to go on much further. But if there's kind of anything really relevant, otherwise, I think we have a sort of a final kind of concluding poll to go to everyone who's still with us. So perhaps we could get that live. So are you considering the use of a remote clinical trials over the next 6 months? Yay or nay? Sandy, would you like to kind of have a few sort of closing words to wrap things up? I think it has been a really very informative and I think detailed session this morning with lots of kind of great engagement as well. And I think lots of good questions, and I'm sure there's a lot to follow up on in future sessions as well, which is always very encouraging to see. I think one of the worst things is when you sort of turn up some of these online sessions and people don't have anything to say, but that's certainly not been the issue this morning.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom, and thanks for moderating so well today. So thank you very much for that. I found the event really informative. I hope the audience did too. I know we have gone a bit over, but I think given what we tried to cover in such a short space of time, I guess that was probably inevitable to some degree. I saw the Q&A was really active. And if your question wasn't answered, please do reach out to us afterwards. We'd be more than happy to help and put you in contact with the right panelists who'll be able to answer your questions for you. This was recorded, so we will share the recording with everyone as well. And beyond that, I'd really like to thank the panelists for sharing their experiences and their knowledge. I hope everyone found it useful. I know I did. And as I said, thanks again, and appreciate you all attending.
Thank you very much, everyone. Look forward to seeing you in the next one.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.